Philadelphia has been a baseball town from the earliest days of the game. A professional league was formed in 1871, and by 1876, a new and more business-like organization was created called the National League. The National League maintained a baseball monopoly in the 1890s, and the Phillies who came to Philadelphia in 1883 were the main attraction. By 1900, the National League was in debt, and it left openings for a possible challenger to its monopoly. Van Johnson was a feisty, hard-drinking, pugnacious, former baseball writer with big ideas. He was also president of the Western League, a minor league organization he had recently renamed the American League. In 1901, Johnson declared his organization a major league, which would battle the National League for players and customers. He persuaded a 38-year-old former big league catcher, Cornelius McGillicuddy, who managed in the Western League, to come to Philadelphia and organize the new team, which would be called the Athletics. McGillicuddy, better known as Connie Mack, was born in East Brookfield, Massachusetts in 1862. As a young man, he worked in a shoe factory until he recognized that baseball represented an escape from industrial toil. By 1886, he was playing for the Washington Club in the National League. Mack was tall and thin as a rail. It was his catching skills rather than his hitting which made him a valuable professional.
Connie Mack was a clever operator behind the plate. He perfected a technique of just ticking the batter's bat so that the interference wasn't detected, but the batter's timing was destroyed. He also had a means of flicking his glove with the hand so that the umpire thought he heard a foul tip and called a strike. Connie Mack loved to win, and he had no moral inhibitions against a little minor chicanery in order to achieve his end there.
Mack eventually landed a job with the Pittsburgh National League team, and after 4 years there became manager. After 2 winning seasons, but finishing far from the top, Mack was fired. He hired on as manager of the Milwaukee Club in the Western League, headed by Van Johnson, and a bond developed between the soft-spoken, genteel Mack and the boisterous, pugnacious Johnson. When Johnson persuaded Mack to leave Milwaukee, Mack put up between $5,000 and $10,000 and received 25% of stock in the new franchise. Mack arrived in Philadelphia in late 1900 and set about organizing his team. With help from 2 local sports writers, Samuel Butch Jones of the Associated Press and Frank Huff of the Philadelphia Inquirer, he located a lot at 29th and Columbia and secured a 10-year lease. He built a ball field there, and it was called Columbia Park.
Columbia Park was built at a cost of $35,000. It seated 9,500 originally, although later the capacity was increased in 1905 to 13,600. The stands were covered behind home plate. There was a little tiny press box on the top, and wire screens bordered the larger part of the stands, and that apparently was to keep foul balls from flying out onto the street. There were no dugouts. The players sat on wooden benches in front of the stands. There was a clubhouse for the home team. The visiting team had no clubhouse. The players would get dressed in their hotels and would be transported to the ballpark by horse and buggy.
Mack's sports writer allies introduced him to local businessman and baseball fan Benjamin Shibe. Shibe wound up with 50% of the club's stock. Mack had 25%, and the 2 newspapermen, Huff and Jones, shared the remaining 25%. In 1901, Benjamin Shibe was elected president of the new ball club and brought both dignity and stability to the organization. In their first year, the Athletics displayed a winning record of 74-62. They finished 4th and drew over 206,000 fans, an average of 3,300 per game. They drew over 442,000 the next year, and by 1907, the crowds reached a high of almost 626,000. Through Frank Huff, Mack found a number of dissatisfied National League players who were ready to vote their teams. The best of them was Napoleon Lajoie, a big Frenchman from Rhode Island. Lajoie was a standout second baseman who averaged .345 over 4 seasons in Philadelphia. The Phillies sought to enjoin Lajoie and pitchers Chick Fraser and Bill Bernhard from jumping to the Athletics, but were unsuccessful. Lajoie as an A was outstanding. he led the American League in hitting with a .422 average, in home runs with 14, and in RBIs with 125. Another standout was Eddie Plank, a young left-hander with a sweeping delivery he called the crossfire pitch. Signed on the recommendation of his Gettysburg College coach, Plank won 17 games for Mack and hundreds more over the next 13 years. The following year, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court reversed the lower court decision, and Lajoie and company were banned from playing with the A's. Despite losing Lajoie, outfielder Elmer Flick, and his two best pitchers, Mack rebuilt his team on the run and picked up an icon, courtesy of John McGraw. Midway through the 1902 season, McGraw deserted the faltering Baltimore Orioles and signed with the New York Giants. From his new vantage point, McGraw told the press that Shibe in Philadelphia had a white elephant on his hands. Mack quickly adopted the white elephant as the symbol for his club. It was an enduring symbol and can still be found on the sleeves of the present-day Oakland Athletics. In 1902, it became a rallying point for Mack and his team as they fought for the pennant. The season turned out to be a wildly successful one, despite the way it began. Outfielder Ralph "Sock" Seybold led the league in home runs, Eddie Plank won 20 games, and a strange young left-hander named George Edward Waddell, known as Rube, won 24 and lost 7. In each of his 6 seasons with the A's, Rube led the league in strikeouts and won 96 games his first 4 years in Philadelphia. Known for his blazing fastball, sharp curve, and good control, Waddell's had a seasonal record of 349 strikeouts that lasted 61 years until broken by Sandy Koufax in 1965.
Rube Waddell was probably mentally retarded, although baseball charitably called him eccentric or carefree as long as he pitched well. He once told a teammate that he had so much speed in his arm that he was afraid he was going to burn up the catcher's mitt. So he went in the dugout and poured ice water over his arm and shoulder to slow himself down.
All in all, Mack's managing job was splendid, and the A's won the American League pennant. It didn't matter that the war between the two leagues prevented a World Series. To their adoring fans, the Athletics were the toast of the town. Peace came to the major leagues in 1903, when the National League recognized that it could not continue a war it was clearly losing. An agreement was made, and a commission was set up to oversee the operation of the game. Unable to repeat their 1902 success, the most noteworthy addition to Connie Mack's team was a 20-year-old right-hander named Charles Albert Bender, 1/4 Chippewa Indian and a product of the Carlisle Indian School and Dickinson College. Bender was known as the chief to all except Connie Mack, who called him Albert and my greatest clutch pitcher. The Athletics reached new heights in attendance, far more than the Phillies, and in 1905, the favorites of the Quaker City were Connie Mack's White Elephants. The Athletics had great pitching. The eccentric Waddell won 26 with an ERA of 1.48. Plank was right behind him with 25. Young Andy Coakley from Holy Cross College won 20, and Chief Bender won 16. The Athletics won the American League pennant and met the New York Giants for their first World Series.
When Lave Cross brought the lineup cards out to the plate for the Athletics, he met John McGraw, the Giants manager, who was bringing the Giants lineup card out. Cross presented him with a wrapped-up gift, which, when unwrapped, turned out to be an effigy of a white elephant. McGraw put it on top of his head, and the fans all roared with laughter. McGraw had a surprise of his own for the A's. He had his Giants team dressed in black uniforms with a white trim and a white NY on it. Even more so, he put Christy Mathewson in one of those uniforms, and Christy Mathewson pitched 3 shutouts in that World Series, and the Giants beat the A's 4-1.
Mack's team was in the chase for the next 2 years, then experienced their first losing season in 1908. During this period, Mack unveiled a new right-handed pitcher, a collegian named Jack Coombs from Colby College in Maine, and a slightly built kid who played football at Columbia. He appeared in 6 games for the A's under the name of Eddie Sullivan in a vain effort to preserve his amateur status. They caught on to him anyway, and he played no more football. When next he played for the Athletics, he did it under his own name, Eddie Collins. In 1908, Collins settled in as a regular at second base. where he would play a total of 2,650 games over 21 years. Nicknamed cocky because he was smart and self-assured, he had the physical ability to do what had to be done and the confidence that he would do it. He stood close to the plate, seldom swung at a bad pitch, and hit to all parts of the field. His intelligence and confidence made Collins a great player and Hall of Famer. Over his long career, he achieved a lifetime batting average of .333, with 3,311 base hits and 743 stolen bases. When his playing days were over, Collins came back to Philadelphia and worked as a coach for Connie Mack. Eventually, he became vice president and general manager of the Boston Red Sox. Mack, tired of trying to handle Waddell, shipped him off to the St. Louis Browns and began working on his younger players like Collins, rookie shortstop Jack Barry out of Holy Cross, and a farm kid from Maryland named Frank Baker. Baker was a shy, quiet, strong young man who swung a bat that weighed an incredible 52 ounces. Over a 13-year career, he batted .307. The A's put good, exciting teams on the field, and the club had excellent attendance figures. It was time for a new ballpark. The wooden park at 29th and Columbia had seen its day. On a site further uptown, Ben Scheib planned a new steel and concrete ballpark covering an entire city block, bounded by Lehigh Avenue, 20th Street, Somerset Street, and the extension of 21st Street. In April of 1908, Scheib broke ground, and the ballpark took a year to build. The facade of the park was done in an ornate French Renaissance style, with arches, vaultings, and ionic columns. The walls were brick, with terracotta ornamentation. The most striking feature of all was the octagonal tower, topped with a dome at the 21st and Lehigh corner of the building, behind where home plate would be located. This tower housed the A's office in its upper levels, and on the ground floor, it served as an elegant main entrance lobby for customers entering the ballpark. Inside, besides the greenest grass seen anywhere, were green seats and olive green walls unadulterated by advertising. The color scheme was broken only with crisp white numbers, 331 in right, 334 in left, and 418 in dead center.
The original capacity of Scheib Park was 23,000. More seats were added over the years. At one point, 2,500 seats were added to the mezzanine. Then there were other seats added at various other times, reaching a full capacity of 33,000 and some change. In the early years, people stood behind ropes across the outfield, and that created a problem because often balls were hit into the spectators, and a ground rule double prevailed.
Scheib Park was a grand place, safe, durable, and a ballpark with great visual appeal. The first game was played on April 12, 1909, against the Boston Red Sox, before a crowd of 30,000. The roofs on 20th Street, overlooking the low right field wall, were filled with onlookers. It would not be long before the homeowners would put up bleachers on their roofs, charge admission, and a new Philadelphia business was born. A new era had begun for the Athletics and Philadelphia. The A's held the American League lead into late August, but that year the A's finished second, 3.5 games behind Ty Cobb's Detroit Tigers. In 1910, Connie Mack's A's proceeded to roll over the rest of the American League. Jack Coombs won 31 games. Eddie Plank and Chief Bender had fine years. Eddie Collins, Danny Murphy, and Rube Oldring all hit 300 or better, and Frank Baker knocked in 74 runs. The A's won 103 games, the American League pennant, and dominated the Chicago Cubs 4-1 in the World Series. On October 24th, the Athletics returned to Philadelphia and brought home their first World Championship. In 1911, the Athletics clinched the pennant on a hot September afternoon with an 11-5 win over the Tigers before 10,000 happy fans at Scheib Park. The coming World Series meeting with John McGraw's New York Giants gave the MacMen an opportunity to avenge the still-galling 1905 loss. The opener was played at the Polo Grounds before a crowd of 38,000. McGraw pulled a surprise by decking his players out in replicas of the all-black uniforms which the Giants had worn for the 1905 series. The ploy received much attention from the press, but had little discernible effect on the A's. They beat the Giants in 4 out of 6 games to win their second World Championship in a row and gained sweet revenge for 1905. With 2 pennants, 2 100-plus victory seasons and 2 world championships in a row, there was no doubt that this athletics team was a great one. Its infield of Stuffy McGinnis, Eddie Collins, Jack Barry, and Home Run Baker was called the $100,000 infield, which in those pre-inflation days simply meant beyond price. After a third-place finish in 1912, Frank Huff and Sam Jones agreed to sell their share to Mack. The transaction left Mack holding 50% interest in both the franchise and the ballpark. Ben Shibe sought to make sure Connie Mack didn't listen to the siren songs of other ball clubs, and there was no downside to guaranteeing Mack's tenure in 1912. Few peers showed the ability to put together winning teams like he did. Also, the image that he projected, the non-swearing, teetotaling manager in his white collar, tie, and dark suit, had value in itself and gave respectability to a sport that craved acceptance but still had some rough edges.
And that image was very real. He was a gentleman of the first order. He was kind and considerate, and when he had to reprimand a player, he did it in private, not to humiliate him. As a matter of fact, some people said he looked like a deacon that wandered onto the ball field. But he was a deacon that knew how to win, and Ben Shibe wanted to make sure he kept winning in Philadelphia.
The Athletics felt that they had loaned the championship to Boston for a year, but at the start of the 1913 season, Mack drummed into his players the necessity of avoiding complacency and overconfidence, and he brought them into the season ready to play ball. The A's moved into first place in April and never looked back. They won 96 games and easily outdistanced Washington by 6.5 lengths. Waiting for the Mack men in the World Series once again were McGraw's Giants, but the A's put them down for the count in 4 out of 5 to win their 3rd World Championship in 4 years. Mack used only 12 players in the entire series, including his pitchers, Eddie Plank, Chief Bender, and Bullet Joe Bush. Whatever questions the 1912 failure might have raised, there were no doubts now. The Philadelphia Athletics, the boys of Benjamin Shibe and Connie Mack, were alone at the top of the baseball world. The years 1914 and 1915 were as hectic and eventful as any 2 years in Philadelphia's long baseball history. The Athletics of 1914 looked as powerful as their predecessor. Wearing new pinstripe home uniforms, still featuring a large blue A on the chest, they took over the lead at the end of May and never gave it back, eventually beating second-place Boston by 8.5 games. Their World Series opponent was the improbable Boston Braves. Short of big-name hitters, the Braves won on pitching, defense, and hard-nosed hustle. Mack's team was considered a sure thing, but the Braves showed them a pitching style they were unaccustomed to. The Athletics couldn't hit and managed only 2 runs in 3 games. The Braves shut out the A's 4-0 and won the championship. Connie Mack returned to his adopted city to consider what he was going to do with his ball club. The club's home attendance, even with a pennant winner, had plummeted from almost 572,000 in 1913 to less than 346,000 in 1914. Mack and Shibe lost money. In fact, when Jack Dunn, the owner of the minor league Baltimore Orioles, offered to sell him a promising pitcher for $23,000, Mack turned him down. The pitcher was George Herman Ruth, better known as Babe. On the last day of October, Mack startled the baseball world by asking waivers on 3 starting pitchers, Chief Bender, Eddie Plank, and Jack Coombs. A new short-lived rival league was after Plank and Bender, and Mack knew he couldn't match their dollars. Then Mack astounded everyone by selling Eddie Collins to the White Sox for cash, rumored to be $50,000. Collins had recently signed a 3-year contract for a princely sum, and the Athletics, Mack and the Shibes, did not have the resources or chose not to risk their resources to fill their ledgers with red ink. Mack planned to fill the spots of departed stars with players who would cost less, and Mack still had Home Run Baker. But because of the money thrown around by the new rival Federal League, Frank Baker asked for a raise. When the A's refused, Baker sat out the whole season and worked on his Maryland farm. The unexpected subtraction of Baker was a stunner for which Mack had no answer, and it magnified his problems for 1915. Losses mounted, attendance dropped sharply, and Mack sold 4 more starters to the Red Sox, Yankees, and White Sox for cash. The net result in 1950 was a record of 43 wins and 109 losses. No other major league team had ever plunged from first place one year to last place the next in an 8-team league. By 1918, Connie Mack had completely disassembled his championship team. The fans looked to better days ahead, but those better days were not to be, and the A's took up long-term occupancy of the American League cellar. By the mid-1920s, the Athletics had shaken off the dust of their 7-year tenure in the American League cellar and began to transform themselves. Mack signed Edmund Bing Miller, an Iowa farm boy, who impressed Mack as a Washington rookie. Miller lived up to it by hitting .336 with 21 home runs and 90 RBIs. Then Mack picked up a 26-year-old left-handed pitcher named George Rube Wahlberg off the waiver wire from the Giants. Despite a habit of tipping his curve, he remained with the A's a long time and was a major contributor. In 1924, Mack paid $50,000 to Baltimore for a left-handed hitting second baseman named Max Bishop. Bishop was nicknamed Camera Eye for his uncanny ability to work pitchers for bases on balls, an ability that made him one of the best leadoff hitters of the time. From Milwaukee, Mack bought a slugging outfielder named Aloysius Szymanski, better known as Al Simmons.
Bucketfoot Al Simmons had a very unusual batting stance. His front foot pointed toward third base, and every young player is taught not to hit that way. But it worked for Al Simmons. He had a .334 batting average over 20 seasons, won 2 batting titles in a row, and was elected to the Hall of Fame. By the way, he was a pretty good outfielder, too.
Another new acquisition was a round-faced, muscular 17-year-old from Maryland's Eastern Shore named James Emery Fox. Frank Home Run Baker, managing the Eastern Maryland team, contacted his old boss about Jimmy Fox. Mack signed the young catcher and got him into 10 games in 1925. He appeared at the plate 9 times and picked up 6 hits for a .667 batting average. A 6th new face was Gordon Stanley Mickey Cochran, a catcher from Bridgewater, Massachusetts, whom the club purchased for $50,000 from Portland. Mickey, a former football star at Boston University, was a fine hitter with rudimentary catching skills. When Cochran came to A's spring training, starter Cy Perkins taught him everything he could about the art and science of catching. Cochran caught 2 hours of batting practice every day, and with constant repetitions, the movements Perkins taught him became ingrained as reflexes. In 1925, Mack was approached by his old friend Jack Dunn of the minor league Orioles. Dunn had a young left-handed pitcher from a small western Maryland town known as Lefty. 6'3" Robert Moses Grove had a blazing fastball and a temper to match. On the day he was scheduled to pitch, he snarled at writers, ignored his teammates, and seemed to hate humanity. Dunn offered Grove to the Athletics, and Mack, who had been forced to refuse Dunn's earlier offer of Babe Ruth, took a big gulp and paid over $100,000 to sign Grove. In 1927, Mack chose to add some seasoned veterans, Eddie Collins and Ty Cobb. The return of Ty Cobb to Philadelphia as a player was ironic. In his earlier days, he fought and feuded with the Philly fans constantly. He spiked Frank Baker and knocked over Eddie Collins. Connie Mack had to call out the police whenever he came to town. There were death threats against him, and there would be tons of plainclothesmen in the stands and all over. But one time, his notorious behavior came back to bite him.
In New York in 1912, Cobb attacked a fan and was suspended. The rest of the Tigers team went on strike, leaving Tigers manager Huey Jennings facing a forfeit and a $5,000 fine. So Jennings and Mack put together a ragtag team of sandlotters and players from St. Joseph's College. 20,000 delighted A's fans who despised Cobb saw the A's beat them 24-2.
It was many years later now, and Cobb was 40 years old, near the end of his career, when he joined the A's. When Mack introduced him at a baseball writers' dinner, he received a standing ovation and was touched by it, especially given his history in Philadelphia. Eddie Collins was 40 years old also. Collins played in 95 games and hit .338, and Cobb, playing as a regular outfielder, hit .357 and led the team in stolen bases. But Mack didn't need the 40-year-olders to show his boys how to hit. The team average was .303. The pace setter was Al Simmons with a .392 average. Jimmy Dykes, a Philadelphian and utility infielder, third baseman Sam Hale, Mickey Cochran, and Jimmy Fox all hit well over .300 in support. Lefty Grove had his first 20-win season and led the league in strikeouts. Pitchers Rube Wahlberg and Eddie Rommel, a fixture since 1920, had good years as well. The Athletics won 91 games, and it got them second place, but 19 games behind the Yankees. This was Babe Ruth's 60-home run season, and both he and Lou Gehrig drove in a combined 329 runs. Second place and 91 wins was no disgrace, but Connie Mack's problem was finding a way to cut down that 19-game differential. To strengthen his team, Mack purchased from the minors a 24-year-old outfielder named George Mule Haas and a hard-throwing right-handed pitcher named George Earnshaw. Haas hit left-handed, ran well, and was projected as a spare outfielder. Earnshaw was a big man, 6'4" and 210 pounds, a Swarthmore College man with a sunny disposition, excellent fastball, and a tireless arm. The 1928 A's caught fire. In midsummer, won 22 out of 26 games and finished second again to the Yankees. But this time they won 98 games with a final margin of just 2.5 games. The mighty Yankees knew they had been in a fight all the way and felt the A's close on their heels. For 1929, the regular lineup was Jimmy Fox at first, Max Bishop played second, Joe Boley at shortstop, and Sammy Hale at third, with Jimmy Dykes, the regular, there at season's end. The outfield was set with Bing Miller, Mule Haas, who replaced Ty Cobb in center, and Al Simmons in left. Mickey Cochran was the regular catcher. Lefty Grove, George Earnshaw, and Rube Wahlberg started most of the games, while Eddie Rommel did most of the relief. Everything worked. Al Simmons still putting his foot in the bucket and leveling a malevolent glare at all pitchers, hit .365 with 34 home runs and a league-best 157 RBIs. Bing Miller hit .335 and drove home 93. Jimmy Dykes hit .327 with 13 home runs and 79 runs batted in. For those managers who decided to throw right-handed pitching at the Athletics, Mickey Cochran and Mule Haas posed constant problems. Cochran hit .331 with 95 RBIs, and Haas .313, driving in 82 with 16 home runs. Jimmy Fox, given a chance to play every day, hit .354 with 33 home runs and 117 runs batted in. Fox would take his place with the great right-handed hitters of all time, compiling a lifetime average of .325.
Jimmy Fox was voted MVP of the American League in both 1932 and 1933. In 1932, he hit 58 home runs, which was more than any right-handed batter in history had ever done. What is more, he had 2 home runs in games at Detroit that were washed out because the games didn't go 5 innings. On top of that, he hit 5 balls against a screen in Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, which was not there in 1927 when Babe Ruth hit his 60. So those would have been home runs for Fox if he had hit them in 1927.
The 29 A's pitching was superb. George Earnshaw won 24. Lefty Grove won 20 and led the league with a 2.82 ERA. Rube Wahlberg won 18 and Eddie Rommel added 12. The result of all this superb work was that the A's ran away from the league. They won 104 games, more than any other in the club's history, and their final margin over the Yankees was an impressive 18 games. Still ahead was a World Series against Joe McCarthy's powerful Chicago Cubs featuring Rogers Hornsby. But the Cubs were up against one of the greatest teams of all time, who stunned them in 4 out of 5 games. After 16 years, the Athletics of Connie Mack were again champions of the baseball world and one of the best ever. The prestigious Philadelphia Award was presented to the 66-year-old Mack, and the people in Philadelphia were delighted. They were accustomed to the sight of the lean, quiet manager sitting in dignified elegance on the dugout bench, waving his scorecard to position his outfielders, and maintaining a splendid composure in both victory and defeat. The accomplishments of the 1929 team were tough to follow, but the Athletics were equal to the task. In 1930, they won 102 games and defeated the St. Louis Cardinals in a 6-game series to wrap up another world championship. For 1931, Connie Mack's aim was simple: to do it again. After winning the American League pennant for a third straight year, the Athletics were favored to defeat the Cardinals, who had run away with the National League title. After 6 games, tied at 3 games apiece, the Cardinals won a hard-fought, well-played World Series. The remarkable 3-year run of Connie Mack's A's was over, but quite a run it was. 3 pennants, 2 World Championships, almost a third, 313 regular season wins, and multifaceted heroics of Groves, Simmons, Cochran, Fox, Earnshaw, Dykes, and the rest of Mack's talented crew. In 1932, the Athletics nucleus remained intact, made a credible showing of 94 wins, but fell behind Joe McCarthy's New York Yankees, who won 107 games. Attendance fell off substantially for the 3rd year in a row, a major worry to Mack and the Shibes. The Depression was cutting harshly into the area's economy, but Connie Mack had the fixed idea that Philadelphia would not support a winning team. He first suspected this with the attendance drop his 1914 pennant-winning team had suffered, and the steady decline from 1929 through 1933 confirmed this in his mind. There was also the matter of money. In 1932, Simmons was paid more than $33,000. Fox made over $16,000, and the other stars were paid similar figures. Mack drew a salary of $50,000. There were debts from a recent renovation of Shibe Park, and rumors that Mack had lost heavily in the stock market crash. Declining attendance put the club in the red, and unlike some club owners, the Macks and Shibes had no cushion of wealth to absorb the losses. At the end of the 1932 season, Mack began the dismantling of his great team. He sold Al Simmons, Mule Haas, and Jimmy Dykes to the White Sox for $100,000. With 3 regulars gone, the A's won 79 games and finished 3rd in 1933. The fans were unhappy, and attendance dropped off again. The A's introduced an outfielder named Bob Johnson. 1/4 Cherokee from Oklahoma, he was soon called Indian Bob. Following the 33 season, Mack sent Lefty Grove, Rube Wahlberg, and Max Bishop to the Red Sox for 2 second-line players and $125,000 in cash. Then Mack shipped the fiery heart of his club, Mickey Cochran, to Detroit, then traded George Earnshaw to the White Sox for $20,000 and a catcher. In 1934, A's attendance increased with the abolition of the state's blue laws, which barred professional sports on Sunday. Baseball could now be played on Sunday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., but the club slid back to 5th place with a losing record of 68 and 82. In 1935, the A's scored 54 fewer runs than in 1934, won 10 fewer games, and fell into last place with a resounding thud. The Athletics clashed with their neighbors on 20th Street when John Shibe had a 30-foot wall addition built on top of the 12-foot high right field fence. The new green corrugated iron fence destroyed the once thriving trade in rooftop seats overlooking the ballpark. No bones were made about the fence's purpose: to defeat the outlaw stands built on rooftops on an adjoining street. After the 1935 season, Mack traded the last great star of the last great A's team when he sent Jimmy Fox and pitcher John Markham to the Boston Red Sox for 2 players and $150,000 in cash. The nucleus of the A's offense was now outfielder Indian Bob Johnson, Wally Moses, a solid hitter from Georgia, and Frankie Hayes, a young catcher. In 1936, Tom Shibe, who had been club president since the death of his father, Ben Shibe, in 1922, passed away. His brother John succeeded him, but died a year later. Curiously, attendance increased in the late 1930s, and new players joined the team. Billy Werber, a veteran infielder who came from Boston in a trade for Higgins, and a former All-American halfback from the University of California named Sam Chapman, who showed up on the recommendation of Ty Cobb, and a local boy from South Philadelphia at shortstop, Al Brancato, and first baseman Dick Seaver. That same year, 1938, the Phillies abandoned Baker Bowl and signed a lease to play in Shibe Park. But playing in the more refined surroundings didn't help. The Phillies drew only 116,000 fans, far under the 385,000 who paid to see the Athletics. In 1939, the Athletics became the first American League club to add light towers to its ballpark, 8 of them, each 146 feet high.
8 towers were built, and the candle power, incidentally, for the lights was large enough to light a highway going from Philadelphia to Cleveland. That was a lot of light, and subsequently the first All-Star game played under the lights occurred at Shibe Park in 1943.
The war years were an interesting, if arduous, time for Connie Mack and his White Elephants. Players were drafted, materials used for making baseball equipment were in short supply. Spring training was held in chilly places to keep railroad lines open. Game times were altered with blackouts and dim outs, and gas rationing affected attendance. Nevertheless, baseball survived, and the game was positioned at the end of the war in 1945 for the great boom which followed. On April 16, 1946, the largest opening day crowd in Shibe Park history, over 37,000, came out to see the dawn of post-war baseball. Despite a dismal season, the bright spots were Sam Chapman and Elmer Vallow. Vallow was a true ball player, and the fans loved his aggressive wall-banging style of outfield play. Outfielder Barney McCoskey hit well also after coming over from the Tigers, but had a shadow hanging over him. That May, the A's traded third baseman George Kell to Detroit for McCoskey, who was hitting 196, but had been a consistent pre-war hitter. Mack loved Kell, but couldn't afford his salary. Kell hit .327 over the balance of that season and went on to have a .305 lifetime average that put him in the Hall of Fame. No matter what McCoskey did, Kell did more. And in 1949, when McCoskey missed the entire season with back trouble, Kell won the American League batting crown. The A's got good pitching from Phil Marshallton, whose fastball and knuckle curve was hard to hit. Buddy Rozar, the catcher, had 0 errors in 147 games, an unprecedented feat for a catcher. Despite a 44-win, 105-loss season, the A's drew almost 622,000 fans. The Phillies in control, with new stars and uniforms, surged into 5th place and drew over 1 million people, the largest for a Philadelphia team. In 1947, the A's posted their first winning season, 78-76, their first winning season since 1933, and drew over 911,000 people, a new club record. The A's were a good and exciting team. Needing a first baseman, Mack picked up a prize in the minor league draft, a left-handed fighter named Ferris Fain. Fain hit the ball hard and played an aggressive game at first base, going after everything near him.
In a butt situation, he would line up halfway between first and home, daring the hitter to bunt in his direction or try to hit the ball by him. And he would charge and sometimes end up almost taking the ball right off the bat.
Another key acquisition by Mack was shortstop Eddie Joost. Mack needed someone to play short and solidify the infield. Eddie Joost produced a huge return. He was probably the best shortstop ever to play for the Philadelphia Athletics.
In 1947, Mr. Mack called me and said, "Son, I've heard a lot of things, good and bad, about you, and I think I like the good ones, and I just bought you from the Rochester baseball team, and you're coming over to play shortstop for me."
Mack had been using Pete Suter, a slender young man from Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, all over the infield. For 1947, he stuck Suter at second base and found himself with the league's fielding leader at the position. The A's also picked up a stocky third baseman named Hank Majeski from the Yankees.
Now, Hank didn't have the greatest hands in the world, but he was stockily built, and he could play the ball and box the ball off his chest, and with his strong arm, fire the ball first and get the guy. Now, the other asset from Hank was that he was also a potential 300 hitter and could hit the long ball. So he gave us that power at third base, which we readily needed.
On the mound, in addition to Phil Marshallton, were Dick Fowler, Russ Christopher, Bob Savage, Bubba Harris, and Carl Scheib, who was the youngest player in the American League during the war years at 16. Also, a pair of good-looking rookies arrived on the scene, Bill McCann, who pitched a no-hitter, and Joe Coleman. Then came Lou Brissy. Lou Brissy was a tall southpaw from South Carolina out of Presbyterian College. He was severely injured in the war, but convinced the Army surgeon not to amputate his leg because he was a ball player. With the help of a new wonder drug, penicillin, 23 operations, and a metal plate that covered his leg, Brissy returned to civilian life and talked Connie Mack into giving him a tryout.
It was my pleasure to catch Lou Brissy in his first major league game against the Boston Red Sox. Lou was noted by Mr. Mack as being the next Lefty Grove coming to Philadelphia. During that game, Lou Brissy was pitching against Ted Williams, and Ted Williams hit a line shot back through the box, which struck Lou on his bad leg, and down he went. It sounded like a drum exploded. But he got up from that, pitched that inning, and went on to win the game, and then went on that year to win 14 games, and the following year, 16 games.
1948 saw the first Philadelphia involvement in a pennant race since 1932. It appeared as if this might be the just one more that Connie Mack had been using for so long to justify his continuing tenure as manager of the A's. Everyone connected with the club was aware that the 85-year-old Mack was not the man he once was. While he continued to sit on the dugout bench and wave his famous scorecard at his outfielders, it was clear now that his coaches ran the team. Behind the scenes, the franchise was operated in a penny-pinching, inefficient way by a coalition of Mack's sons, Scheib descendants, and the McFarlands, who were married to the Scheibs. Yet in 1948, the A's made a strong run at the pennant with a solid starting lineup, good starting rotation, no bench, and no bullpen. The club drew a record attendance of 960,000. The 1948 A's were unlikely pennant contenders, yet they scrapped, hustled, waited out bases on balls, and finished fourth at 84-70. In 1949, they were 81-73 and finished fifth, but weren't a factor in the pennant race. Two new arrivals that year were Alex Kellner, a left-hander from Arizona who won 20 games, and another southpaw from nearby Pottstown named Robert Clayton Shantz. Shantz was listed at 5'6" and 140 pounds, but no one ever questioned his heart. He pitched for 16 years in the majors and spent 8 seasons with the A's. That same year, the A's spelled Pete Suter at second base with a young infielder who hit .255. But the A's brain trust somehow got the idea that this youngster was a bit lackadaisical. So they traded him to the White Sox for a backup catcher. This youngster went on to play 19 years with a lifetime batting average of .288. His name was Nellie Fox. As 1950 approached, the A's hoped to offer a strong challenge for the American League pennant. With the nucleus from the 1948 team still intact, it was Connie Mack's 50th year as manager, and a fitting time for that just one more. The A's surrounded Mack with great players from his past. Brought in as coaches were Jimmy Dykes, Mickey Cochran, and Big Miller. The A's made trades, reinforced the team, spent $80,000 on improvements to the park, and began broadcasting all their games home and away live on radio station WIBG with Byram Saam and Claude Herring. Dykes, now a veteran manager in both the major and minor leagues, took over the day-to-day direction of the team, with Connie Mack receding into the background. That August, the controlling interest in the club was sold to sons Earl and Roy Mack. To buy the team, they mortgaged the club to the Connecticut General Life Insurance Company for $1,750,000, and they borrowed additional cash from a local builder. This transaction ensured that the franchise would continue to be run on a shoestring, cash poor, and never knowing how the next payroll would be met. A few days later, Connie Mack officially ended his historic tenure as manager, and Jimmy Dykes was named in his place. 89-year-old Connie Mack retained the title of president, but the club was no longer his.
he was such a respected individual. He'd sit in the lobby and very straight. You know, he was a very straight guy with a hat on, and everybody would go by, and they would not try to get him into conversations, but they would always respect him and say hello to him. And I think he's one of the top legends in baseball. You know, you got the Roos, the Gehrigs, you know, all these guys that played, but Connie Mack by name has to be one of the top names in baseball. And it was a pleasure for me to have met him.
The team finished last in 1950 with a record of 52 wins and 102 losses, while the Phillies won the National League pennant. In 1951 under Dykes, the club climbed up a few notches and finished 70 and 84 with some inspired trading by a new general manager, Arthur Ehlers. In a three-way deal with the Chicago White Sox and the Cleveland Indians, the A's welcomed outfielder Gus Zernial and Dave Philly. Philly and Zernial became stars in Philadelphia. Philly was an all-around player, a switch-hitting outfielder with power and good speed. Zernial was a big, handsome blonde from Texas with an open face, free swing, and the fans loved him. In 1951, he hit 33 four-baggers, drove in 129 runs, and claimed both the home run and RBI crowds.
I remember it was early in the season. I forget what the date was, but Al Rosen was leading the league in home runs at that particular time. But all of a sudden, I came up with 7 home runs in 4 consecutive games. And those are great memories because that record has never been broken. It's been tied several times by several different ball players. But I remember I hit 2 off the Yankees, and I hit a couple off the Browns, I think it was, in Detroit. So that was a good start. The fans took to me. I had the good year. We had good ball players, and we were in contention all year.
Elmer Vallow and Billy Hitchcock both hit 300 that year. Bobby Shantz won 18 games, and Dykes got fine support from Alex Kellner, Bob Hooper, and a Missouri southpaw named Maury Martin. But the spotlight was on Ferris Fain, who came into his own and won the batting title with a mark of .344. His fiery temper almost kept him from winning the title. In mid-July, after hitting a pop-up, Fain angrily kicked first base and fractured his foot. He missed 37 games, but came back in late August to add 10 points to his average.
I remember one time in Detroit, Ferris's temper showed again. He was trying to make a play at third base and show his strong arm and get the runner as he rounded the bag attempting to go home. Well, the ball sailed over the third baseman's head, 14 rows up into the seats. The runner came in to score, and as we came in after the inning to the dugout, Mr. Mack was very upset, and he said, "Young man, I don't want you to make that throw again." And Ferris, with his fiery temper, said, "Well, where do you suggest I stick it? Where the sun doesn't shine?" Mr. Mack very calmly said, "That might be a good place for it, son."
1952 was much better. Fain won another batting title. Zernial hit 29 homers, drove in 100 runs. A hard-throwing right-hander, Harry Bird, was Rookie of the Year, and Bobby Shantz enjoyed a super season. Won 24, lost 7, posted an ERA of 2.48, and that was the year he was voted the American League MVP. The A's finished 4th with a 79-75 record, but were unable to draw more than 627,000 spectators. The 1953 A's were a disappointment for Jimmy Dykes, for the Macks, and the whole franchise. In his first start, Shantz tore a muscle in his shoulder and was not up to par the whole season. Fain was traded, and Eddie Juice was reaching the end of his career. He played in only 51 games, and Joe DeMaestri, a utility player, played most of the year at shortstop. Gus Zernial, Pete Suter, and Joe Astra did well at the plate, and Dave Philly had his best season yet, but the team slipped to 7th place, winning 20 fewer games than in 1952. Attendance fell to 362,000, almost half of the year before. In 1954, there was no hope. The team looked bad, and there was no money. Earl Mack made himself general manager and named Eddie Juice as manager.
Jimmy Dykes, 53, was the manager of the ball club, and we were talking one day, and the ball club wasn't doing too well even with Jimmy, and Jimmy was a great guy and a good manager. And he called me over about a month before the season was over, and he said, "Eddie, I just want to let you know you're going to be the manager of the ball club next year." And I said, you're kidding. He said, no, no, no. He said, this is going to be. He says, you can't make it official. It's just between you and I. And I said, Jim, I don't want to do that. I can still play. He said, well, tell you what, it's an opportunity, so take it. He said, you can't do any worse than I did. I finished 8th. If you finish 7th, you're a magician.
Jimmy Dykes and Arthur Ehlers moved to Baltimore. Dave Philly, after a good year, wanted a raise. With no money in the till, he was traded to Cleveland. So was Harry Bird to get rid of his big salary. Despite the changes, or because of them, the 1954 Athletics sunk to the bottom. They won 51 games, lost 103. Most of the games were neither close nor interesting. The crowds dwindled, the mortgagee made threatening noises, and management went heavily into debt. In early August, Chicago businessman Arnold Johnson, who was connected to the Yankees farm team in Kansas City, offered to buy the A's for $3.3 million and move them to Kansas City. The deal was completed at the end of the 1954 season. Bob Carpenter, owner of the Phillies, bought Shibe Park, which had been renamed Connie Mack Stadium, for $1.7 million. The Athletics part in the history of Philadelphia baseball had come to a close. On the whole, it had been the best part, with the early pennants, the great teams of Plank, Waddell, and Lajoie, the $100,000 infield, and the mighty crew of Simmons, Cochran, Fox, and Grove. Even near the end, the 1948 contender and such favorites as Just, Chance, Vallow, Fain, and Zernial had given the A's fans their share of glorious moments. But the failure of the Mack family to keep up with changing times, as well as the lack of resources, condemned the franchise to exile. In the post-war era, with ever-increasing costs of operating a modern franchise, Philadelphia did not have a fan base large enough to support 2 baseball teams. Connie Mack stayed on in Philadelphia, attending an occasional Phillies game at the old ballpark, whose name had been changed to honor him. On February 8, 1956, he died at the age of 93, the last connection to the early days of the game gone. But the baseball team he created and nurtured for over a half-century still resonates in Philadelphia's collective memory.